No longer will the future belong solely to the credential. Who's going to own the future are the curious, the street smart, the relentless, the people who can walk into uncertainty and come out carrying opportunity. People who do not wait for permission, people who do not confuse a closed door with the end of the road. When they see a gig, they realize there can be so much more. A window of opportunity, a test, a proving ground. Something to put in your knapsack you're going to use later in life. My guest today is Devine.
Get up, get out and do it. Do what you have to do. Because the only one stopping a person from doing anything really is themselves.
And she's lived that way her entire life. Get a picture as a little girl selling lilacs in the corner of Broadview and Queen in Toronto. She's raised by her grandmother. They don't have a lot of money, but what Robin had was instinct. She could read people. She could spot possibility. She could find value in what others dismissed.
When you have nothing, you have to look for opportunities in life. And that's what luck is. Luck is knowing when there's an opportunity and taking it.
And that became the pattern of her life. She left school early and became a copywriter. In her 20s, she found herself in a broken down garage, looking at a checker automobile, cars that most people had written off. But Robin saw something different. Not a taxi, not a relic, not a leftover. What she saw was character. She saw a statement. She saw a reverse status symbol. And that's what you're going to learn Robin does. Turning overlooked things into wanted things, cars that become symbols, watches that become stories, pre-sales that become a business model, campaigns that become causes, and causes become a way for Robin to give back to veterans, food banks, shelters, regiments, and communities across Canada. But this story is not just about entrepreneurship, it's about agency. It's about choosing yourself when nobody else has. It's about the courage to enter rooms where you might not have the credentials, but you have the conviction and even a little swagger.
And I said, look, you've seen my portfolio. You know right now, do you or don't you want to hire me? He said, when do you want to start? I said, Monday.
And in today's economy, we talk a lot about side hustles and personal brands, reinvention and resilience. But Robin's lived all of that before it had language, before it was part of vernacular. Robin was never just trying to sing for her supper. She wanted to own the diner. So today we're going to talk about how to build your own life, your own luck, and your own way forward.
When one door closes, you keep kicking doors open.
Hi, it's Tony Chapman. Thank you for listening to Chatter That Matters, presented by RBC. If you can, please subscribe to the podcast. And ratings and reviews, well, they're always welcome and they're always appreciated.
Robin Devine, welcome to Chatter That Matters.
Thank you so much. I am so excited, and what a fantastic introduction.
Well, you are a fantastic human being, and I want to, before we get into the Robin of today, I just love that story of the little girl on Broadview and Queen selling lilacs. So take me back to that time in your life.
Well, I was raised by my grandmother at Broadview and Queen, and, we didn't have a lot of money. It was just solid working class. My grandmother said, if I wanted to earn a little bit of extra money, I didn't only sell lilacs, I went door to door selling rhubarb. Because we had these rhubarb stalks that were almost 100 years old because it was my grandmother's house growing up when she was a child. And I still have the coal that she collected when she used to go during the Depression. They'd go down to the railway tracks and they would pick up coal to heat their homes. And I still have that coal in my house. I've never drank in my entire life because I would see all the people getting off the streetcar at Broadview and Queen who came from the racetrack. And I'd stand there and I'd sell my lilacs, but it was safe. It was safe there. And the thing that was interesting too, that people won't know, the old Broadview House Hotel that was right beside the streetcar stop, Robert Goulet used to go there when he was in town, and Walter Matthau, so it had quite the history.
You talk about your grandmother collecting the coal, and, my mom was a Depression baby and certainly instilled a lot of the value of money, the value of hard work and ethics. Do you really feel that's what's been that superpower in your DNA, is that your grandmother blessed you with her hardship, but in a way that you turned it into your prosperity?
My grandmother was a really interesting person. Her name was Lillian Taylor. And she was the youngest of 3 children, and she had to leave school with a grade 5 education to take care of her brother and sister, who both had university educations. And Lillian taught me, even at 5 years of age, there wasn't anything that I couldn't do. And she taught me, the first thing she'd say, because they used to say instead of going on errands for people, it was to run messages. And when I would go on a message, she'd say, the first thing you have to do is give the person their change. Even if it's 1 cent, give them their change. And when I was a little girl, I used to go into all the stores at Broadview and Queen. There was the barber shop. There was the funeral parlor. And I would sell cookies at school, to win prizes. I'd go to the funeral home and the funeral director would buy all my cookies and give them to his clients. So it was really just something that, in those days, getting on the streetcar was 5 cents. And going to the movie theater was 15 cents. And I remember when they raised the price from 15 cents to 25 cents, we all stood and yelled on the street. So I was raised to be honest and to be decent and to work hard.
What a lot of people I would argue, have many of those lessons, but you're fearless. You're going into a funeral home, you're going into a barber shop. Where do you think you got that courage to say it has nothing to do about age or whether I belong here or not? It has everything to do with this is exciting and this is opportunity.
Nothing was inculcated at that time. When I grew up years later, I used to lecture for the Ontario Women's Directive in the school system. And this was before it was ever talked about gender. I seem to always do things ahead of the post. And I used to say I'm a non-gender speaker. And what I meant by that was, to me, it didn't matter if you were a male or you didn't matter if you were a female. It was like, get up, get out and do it. Do what you have to do. Because the only one stopping a person from doing anything really is themselves. And I had nothing. So it's not like somebody can say, oh, you came from a privileged background.
Do you think it's, looking back now, it was to your advantage that you had very little and had to go after anything you wanted versus being born in privilege where you feel everything's within arm's reach of desire, or today I can just use my phone as the world's largest vending machine, but you had to go after it?
I would say you have a good point there, because when I used to be director of the Ontario Development Corporation, I was for 7 years. The people who sat on my board with me was a woman who owned Lipman's clothing store chain. It used to be huge. And Doug Wright, who became the head of McMaster University, not McMaster, Waterloo. We all came from Broadview and Queen. We all came from the same area. We were all East Enders. And I really think that had a lot to do with it. It's really funny too, because where I live, and I've been blessed. The fellow who lives 2 streets over from me was in my kindergarten class. What are the odds we'd both come from that end of the city with nothing and succeed? My daughter, when she was born, blessed because I'd become successful, by then. But I took her to Mothers and Tots in the Broadview and Queen, Cape and Danforth area. And I taught her to be comfortable and to be happy with everyone and to never judge a book by its cover.
Speaking of books, you go to community college, you leave school after your first year, you end up a copywriter. And back then, I'd have to imagine that, number one, a woman getting into copywriting was probably an anomaly, and especially one that had dropped out of community college. So how did you work your way into that world?
We were in class one day and the teacher at the time said, don't go to Toronto to find a job. The chances of finding a job, he's telling us to the class, are nil. Go to a small place. And I said, well, what if a kid offered, to work for free? The next day I went to Foster Advertising at Yonge and St. Clair. And I said, is your creative director in? And they said, no, he's out to lunch with a client. So I sat there in the lobby. And he came in and the woman there said, oh, this is him. His name was Tom Scott. And I said to him, hi, my name's Robin Devine. I'm really bright. I'm really creative. I'll work for free. Will you give me a break? I remember verbatim when I said to him, he was with the client. He said, great commercial, sold me, and said, when do you want to start? So I started at Foster Advertising. And it was really interesting because I was still going to school. I finished the year. I didn't finish the course, but I did complete the year. And then I started calling advertising agencies, and I called Vickers and Benson. And I told them that I worked for Foster. I didn't tell them that I worked for free, of course. And that's when Terry O'Malley was there and they hired me. It was really amazing what we were allowed to do because there was a fellow by the name of John Hoffman, and he worked with me. He was a student from OCA. And we created the book that was called Say You're Liberal. It was the book that went to all the candidates. Common everyday language. There wasn't anything sophisticated. It was like, knock on a door. This is what you have to say. Make them sound or be their friend, And I still have those books. And then from there, I went to another advertising agency and, they paid me $6,100 a year. Like I couldn't live on it. And then my grandmother, she saw an ad for a chain of department stores called Century Department Stores. And you were supposed to make an appointment, but I just ran over. Like, I don't know. I just went sick and I speak to the person and I showed him my portfolio and he looked and he said, well, I have to think about it. His name was Reg Wheaton. And I said, look, you've seen my portfolio. Right now, do you or don't you want to hire me? He said, when do you want to start? I said, Monday. And until the day he died, we were friends.
23, you answer an ad from someone looking for a partner to sell checker automobiles out of a broken down garage. Why would you even take that meeting?
When you have nothing, you have to look for opportunities in life. And that's what luck is. Luck is knowing when there's an opportunity and taking it. John Zolnarovich, lovely old Polish fellow. And I went to see him and he didn't do anything with me. And then at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, a year later, the phone rang. I remember these things vividly. And he said, do you want to be my partner? I said, yes. He said, okay, you have to put in $5,000. Well, I didn't have $5,000. But my husband, Chuck, who had just left the Hong Kong police force and was now in the Toronto police, he had $5,000 to his name and I was engaged to him. He said, Robin, take the money. And the deal I had with John was that he owned the garage because I don't know anything about mechanics, but we had a 50-50 partnership, but I also got a 30% commission on top of my 50-50 partnership. So really I was probably taking in about 65%.
People saw checkers as a taxi. What made you realize that there was a different game to be played?
Well, the car that he had, his personal vehicle, wasn't the taxi, even though he was involved with taxis. It was a checker automobile, had a bullet hole in the rocker panel. I don't know how that got. I mean, this is 1979. What happened was a fellow came to my office one day, and we're still friends. His name is Jerry Amernick. He's a quite famous writer. He has a new book that just came out. And he said, I want to write an article about you for Air Canada. En Route magazine became the most successful article in the history of En Route. They made me their worldwide testimonial, and it became a multi-million-dollar company like overnight. And UPS started in Canada with my cars. They couldn't get their van license. So I would see the big stretch checkers on the highway, and they'd have the racks on top of the roof, crate at the back of the car, and they'd have all the parcels. And they were supposed to buy another 100 cars from me if they didn't get their van license. So I'd call Canada Post and I'd call the union and I said, UPS can't get their license. They shouldn't get their license. This is something that Canada Post has to have. But they got their license, so I didn't get the extra 100 cars. People like who came to buy cars from me, like Elvio Del Zotto, who I'm Tridel. And Elvio, I didn't know who Elvio was. They didn't mean anything to me in the sense of other people gravitate towards people because, that's who they are. And he would talk to me. We would just talk. And then, Tom Smith, who was the president of Heinz Canada, bought a car. And Austin Taylor, he was funny. He was the chairman of McLeod, Young and Weir. And he came to buy a car. He was a big man, really big man. And he walked up and I had this rickety old garage, hemming and hawing. And I said, I think you should buy a Cadillac. I don't think this is for you. So he calls me the next day. His brother-in-law was William F. Buckley. And William F. Buckley had a checker. So did Peter Falk. And he said, okay, I'll take one. But what was really cool was he had a chauffeur. His name was Rudy. And because he was such a big fellow, it was a hard time getting into cars. But with the checker, he could open the door. He put a little oriental carpet on the floor because it didn't have any hump in the back. And he could walk straight through one door and out the other. And like in Gerald Bronfman, oh my gosh, he bought a checker. And we did the last interview with his car on CBC and they played the music from Taxi. and then he slams the door shut. It was wild, and as I said, I coined the phrase "no frills" long before Loblaws ever used it.
Did you get a good return on your $5,000?
Oh, did I ever? Well, it became a multi-million-dollar company till they started making them. It was a point too where it had to retool, because the molds were so warped, and they just started making the frames for Firebird and Camaro and for General Motors, and that was it. What was a huge success one day, I had nothing.
So what did you do?
I didn't owe any money to anybody. Pay your debts, be honest, and be kind. And I didn't know what I was going to do. So a fellow called me, and his name was Mel Stein. I had seen the day before a fellow who was on TV about these cars he made. And they were 1952 MGTV reproduction automobiles. And I said to my husband, I said, Chuck, that is so cool. Mel Stein calls me the next day and says, Robin, this company's going into receivership. Why don't you buy it? So because I didn't know any money, I went to the Royal Bank. On a handshake, unsecured, they gave me all the money I needed to buy his company out of receivership. But what I did with the MGs that was a little different. I always tend to do things different than anybody else. So they were called kit cars at the time. They'd come in a box, you put them together. But the difference was I had this partner in Campbellford, Ontario, and he used to make the mold. So it wasn't really a kit car anymore. It didn't come in a box. But I called it a reproduction automobile. I tried to have the car on display in mainstream car shows. So I took it to LA and had it on display there. And Paul Anka came and he sat in it. It was really, really wild. And then I thought, okay, well, instead of selling these as retail cars, like I did with the Checker, I'm going to go after all the corporations and have them give them away as prizes. Wendy's gave them away. Gillette gave them away. The different lotteries gave them away. And Simpsons, actually, I guess by that time, it was the Bay. Ken Thompson, they put the car in the store on display, had it on the front page of one of their catalogs. And then Canadian Tire, oh my goodness, Canadian Tire went to the factory in Campbellford. Why don't we sell the cars out of Canadian Tire? And they were going to do that, but what stopped them was the satisfaction or the money refunded. So instead, they put the offer out to all of their store owners. And I can't even tell you how many of the store owners bought my 1952 MGTV reproduction automobile. Then we have Expo 86. I named the car the Trillium in honor of the province of Ontario. Because I thought, there's the New Yorker, there's the Bonaventure, there's all these other cars, and there's nothing named after Ontario. So I contacted a fellow, and his name was Stu Kell, and he was the commissioner for Ontario at Expo 86 in Vancouver. And I said, oh, gee, I have the Trillium automobile. I'd really love to put this car on display at Expo 86. And he said, well, Robin, General Motors sponsors all of the cars, for the people who are working here from Ontario. And unless you know a guy by the name of David, who I didn't know, and he tells me to do it, sorry, can't do it. And I still have the letter. Well, I didn't know David Peterson. He just got elected. So I sent this letter to his chief of staff. And I said, hi, my name's Robin Devine. I was raised at Broadview and Queen from humble beginnings. I think that this car should be there to represent the hopes and dreams of people from Ontario. And next thing you know, he contacts Stu Kell. They hire a truck. They take my little MG all the way to Vancouver. Now, the pavilion was already built. It was a big sphere, like an Ontario place.
Yeah.
They hired a crane. They had to lift my car through the roof of the Ontario pavilion. They put it in front of the Trillium restaurant. I still have the sign in my basement that says, the Trillium automobile is here today to represent the hopes and dreams from people from Ontario, Canada, who come from humble beginnings.
When we come back, Robin moves on from checker cars to watches to Russian generals and just everything she seems to do every day to make positivity contagious.
Hi, this is Tony Chapman. I want to talk to you about what RBC Wealth Management is doing to support healthy aging. Old age is becoming old news. We're living longer, and planning for our future means we need to integrate health, wellness, and our financial matters. RBC Wealth Management is partnering with leading experts and organizations like the MIT Age Lab, the National Institute on Aging, the Women's Brain Health Initiative, Elder Caring, and the Women's Age Lab. Why? To provide you with comprehensive resources covering every aspect of you aging well. This includes support for your physical and mental health, caregiving, maintaining financial stability, and preparing for later life health issues, ensuring you can age safely and comfortably, and ideally in your own home. With RBC Wealth Management, you create a personalized plan that adapts as your needs change, giving you peace of mind and security. Visit rbcwealthmanagement.com and learn more about healthy aging and start planning for your future. Healthy aging? Well, that matters to you, to me, and to RBC.
Like, it was wild. And Eddie Greenspan, oh my gosh, when he bought his car and they were playing on the radio, believe it or not, I'm walking on air. I was driving his car to deliver it. And I thought, I'm walking on air. And then Morton Schulman, years later, wanted a checker, came to my home, knocked on the door and said, "You're the checker lady? I really want to buy a car." And I said, "Well, I don't think Eddie Greenspan, I don't know if he still wants to keep his." But as soon as I heard Morton wanted to buy it, it was like they kept it.
Joining me today is Robin Devine, one of the most enchanting, wonderful people I've ever interviewed. And her story of making things happen versus watching what happens has never been more appropriate than it is today. How did you go into the watch business from the trillium business?
So a group of very interesting people came along to buy my company. One of them was the president of a German bank, and he happened to be the fundraiser when Robert Campo, remember about Bloomingdale's?
Sure.
And because I didn't own the company, I refused to be a signatory. So I said, I'll work for you. I'll help you out, because they wanted me to do this transition. But I said, I will not be a signatory for anything, because if I'm not in control of my own destiny for what's right and what's wrong, I don't want to be a party to it. I moved on. That was that. And then I had Laura. I was the director of the Ontario Development Corporation at the time. And I was on the foundation board of Toronto East General Hospital. And I stayed at home for 5 years so that I was there with her. And then my friend called me and said, "Oh, Robin, I've been trying to close this deal with the Mint for the first Toonie watch. If I can close the deal, we're going to be 50-50 partners." And he said, "Okay." And we closed the deal. And that was that.
You also found time to really help your husband, Chuck, in terms of him wanting to put some of the stories of his life on paper.
My husband, Chuck, was a Toronto police officer for almost 50 years who passed away recently. And he was brilliant. And he was a fabulous writer. And when I first met him, he was working on a book and he couldn't find an agent. He sent out things everywhere, but he was fabulous. So Stanley Colbert at that time was one of the top agents, I'd say, in North America. Stanley and Nancy Colbert. His brother-in-law was Peter Lawford. And they had a home on Avenue Road. And I knocked on the door and I said, "Hi, this is me. This is my husband's manuscript. This is what he's done. Would you please look at it? He's a fabulous writer." And Stanley looked at it. He read it and he said, "You are," to Chuck, "you're a diamond in the rough." And when he sold the book to Random House, Chuck received the highest advance in Canadian history at that time. And after Stanley Colbert retired, he went to Henry Morrison, and Henry Morrison represented Robert Ludlum. The first book he wrote was called The Glorious East Wind, and it was about the lease expiring in Hong Kong. And Chuck was a visionary. Like, he predicted Tiananmen Square 10 years before it ever happened. And then with Evil Never Sleeps, that was his second book. That was about the drug cartels. And it was just unbelievable. I think it's the only book I've heard of that they had to change the ending in the paperback from the hardcover, because in 30 years, the government was finally thrown out and it was a new government in Mexico. Unbelievable. And then, he has the book now, Who Has Buried the Dead, from Stalin to Putin, that he wrote just before he passed. Well, he wrote it. It took a long time to write the book. It was the most important thing in his life. And like, people who have, read the book and have written reviews about it. There was one written just in November of this year. They can't get over the correlation, the similarity between what's happening right now between Russia and Ukraine, so similar to what happened historically. So, for example, I don't know if you knew or people knew that during World War II, Lucky Luciano, the gangster, provided the Americans intelligence through the mafia, detailed drawings of Sicily's coastline and harbors for the July 1943 invasion. And the other thing that was in the book was about Leslie Howard, who was in Gone with the Wind, and he's a fabulous actor. He was intercepted in a flight by the Germans, and that's how he died.
So many stories.
Well, we had 7 Russian generals in our backyard in Toronto. I mean, Major General Kulikov. And this is an interesting story, also dealing with finance, because the day after the event in our backyard, and it was sanctioned by the government of Canada, and the RCMP were here, they went out to the tarmac to get on the plane. And it was David Boothby, who was the chief at the time, and Norm Gardner. And Kulikov, who had never spoken a word of English at the time, spoke English, took his hat off, put it on Chuck's head. But the second they arrived back in Russia was when Russia defaulted on their national sovereign debt. They devalued the ruble. The world economy went into chaos. It was called Black Monday. It was 1998. And they couldn't do that till 7 Russian generals went back to Moscow from my home because they were responsible for dealing with the insurrection. So if anyone wants to read the most amazing novel that's current, Who Has Buried the Dead, from Stalin to Putin, from Optimum Publishing.
Listening to you, it's like everything you touch turns to gold. But I know that you've also had some near misses in moment. How do you deal with when somebody actually has the audacity to say no to you?
Well, do you remember the Chumbawamba song? I get knocked down, I get up again.
Yeah.
To keep me down. Like, 2 big things happened. John Woo and Terrence Chang were going to make a movie out of Evil Never Sleeps. And they were filming the movie with Ben Affleck at the time, Paycheck. And they had stopped everything for a while because they were negotiating this deal. And we were sitting by the phone in this kitchen waiting for the phone to ring. And the person who they had hired that was going to write the initial script got a new agent. The new agent said he couldn't do it. Instead, he was writing Dustin Hoffman's new film. And that was it. Done. And it's like, what happens? One day Checker is a multi-million-dollar company. The next day, it's nothing. When one door closes, you keep kicking doors open. And the other thing is really wrong with people is people blame other people for things that go wrong in their life. And that's the biggest mistake that anyone can ever have. You can't blame other people when something goes wrong. You have to take responsibility for yourself and say, okay, things aren't going the way I want it. How can I make it better? What can I do? And you don't need a whole army of people to help you. You need one person, one kind person.
Robin, I think this is such a timely interview because a lot of doors are getting slammed in a lot of faces right now. Some of them are reality. Others are just the fact that social media has made us feel like the world's going to end. Every story is about impossibility and negativity. And I think why your story is so important, and I always share it with my 3 takeaways. The lesson your grandmother, she never told you that something was wrong. She encouraged you to try and do things, keep going after things. And I love when you said, get up, get out, and do it. And it's just sort of call to action that says, you can get knocked off, you can get turned down, and you have every reason to be a victim. You have every reason to just go into a fetal position and say, my life is done. But that wasn't how you're wired. And I think that's a real important thing to people. It's not that you had pedigree. It's not that you were lathered in degrees. You just had this sense of make things happen versus watch what happens. And the last thing is just really, which sort of summarizes my first 2 points, and I think summarizes this interview, is no matter how bad things are, there's always windows to open.
We have to talk about the Canada Watch, Tony.
Let's end with the Canada Watch.
Okay.
What is that?
Well, okay. So this is the beautiful new watch. And it's for food banks and shelters because I make most of the watches and I've underwritten the cost, for the Canadian military. Yeah. And so for 2 years while he was sick, just what you're talking about right now in Canada, and everybody's so down. I thought, here's the beautiful maple leaf, here's the Canada Watch, and $20 from each watch is going to food banks and shelters. And that can make a huge difference My website is timeisticking.ca. My videos about Canada with the moose and the loon and the beaver are hysterical. A friend did it for free for me. And the Canada watch is absolutely stunning. And you can wear Canada on your wrist every day. And you know, the astronauts just went to the dark side of the moon. Well, look at the face of my watch. It's black with the maple leaf. And if the astronauts would like a watch, I'd love to give them one.
Robin, you are hilarious. You're energetic. You're wonderful. I'm sorry that Chuck is no longer with you, because couldn't describe a better power couple, from Russian generals and authorship to checker cabs and watches and everything in between. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I just want to tell you from the bottom of my heart, this meant so much to me.
Once again, a special thanks to RBC for supporting Chatter That Matters. It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening, and let's chat soon.